If Parmenides was right and motion and plurality are impossible, how can one convince those who trust their senses and see moving, changing things everywhere? Zeno of Elea, his disciple, devised a method to defend his master without merely repeating his arguments. Instead of asserting directly that motion does not exist, Zeno granted his opponents their premises and showed them that, if accepted, even more unacceptable contradictions would follow. Thus were born his celebrated paradoxes, Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow that never reaches its target, the dichotomy that prevents the first step. In this lesson we shall examine Zeno's method, his paradoxes against motion and plurality, and the legacy of a thinker who, asserting nothing, questioned everything. The problem Zeno addresses is, in essence, the same as Parmenides, to show that motion and plurality are impossible. Yet his way of tackling it is radically different. Parmenides had constructed a positive argument: being is, non-being is not, and from this the attributes of what is follow. Zeno, by contrast, asserts nothing directly. His strategy is to grant the opponent everything they ask for, and then to demonstrate that these concessions lead to unsustainable contradictions. This problem has two dimensions. The first is dialectical. Zeno does not say, motion does not exist. He says, let us suppose it does, as you claim. Let us see where that takes us. And what follows is a chain of reasoning that ends in absurdities. If Achilles never catches the tortoise, if the arrow is always at rest, if we cannot even take the first step, then something is wrong with our notions of space, time, and motion. Zeno does not tell us exactly what is wrong. He only shows us that something is. The second dimension is logical. Zeno's ultimate aim is not to destroy physics but to defend Parmenides. If the alternatives to Eleatic monism lead to contradiction, then Eleatic monism, counterintuitive though it is, becomes the only rationally defensible position. One need not prove that Parmenides is right. It suffices to prove that everyone else is wrong. The methodological break is profound. Before Zeno, philosophers argued for their own theses. Zeno inaugurates a new style, arguing against the theses of others. Reductio ad absurdum, which had appeared tentatively in Parmenides, becomes with Zeno a systematic philosophical tool. It is not an occasional resource, it is the method itself. What we know of Zeno has reached us through a handful of indirect testimonies. Not a single original work of his survives. Everything depends on what later authors, often hostile, chose to quote or refute. The primary source is Aristotle. In books V and 8 of the Physics, Aristotle sets out and discusses the paradoxes of motion in some detail. Without him, we simply would not know Zeno's arguments. But Aristotle is not a neutral transmitter. He presents the paradoxes in order to refute them, and his account may not reflect the original formulation with precision. We cannot know to what extent the paradoxes we read in Aristotle are the very ones Zeno formulated. The second fundamental source is Simplicius, the 6th century Neoplatonist. In his commentaries on Aristotle's physics, Simplicius quotes a few verbatim fragments of Zeno. They are few and brief, but they allow us a glimpse of the original style: dry, tightly linked reasoning, without rhetorical flourishes. These quotations are the closest thing we have to Zeno's direct voice. Plato, in his dialogue Parmenides, offers a literary portrait of Zeno as the young disciple who has written a book in defense of his master. There Zeno explains his method, to grant the premises of Parmenides' opponents and show that they lead to consequences even more ridiculous than the Eleatic theses. It is a valuable source for understanding Zeno's intention, though not for grasping the detail of his arguments. The hermeneutical problems are therefore considerable. We lack the original text. We depend on a transmitter who refutes what he transmits. The verbatim fragments are few and brief, and the reconstruction of the order and scope of the original arguments is, to a large extent, conjectural. Zeno lived in Elea, the same Greek colony in southern Italy that had given birth to the Eleatic school with Parmenides. He was about a generation younger than his master, perhaps 25 years his junior, and tradition presents him as Parmenides' closest disciple. Plato, in the dialogue Parmenides, portrays him as an intelligent man, loyal and passionate about argumentation. The circumstances in which Zeno wrote his book of paradoxes were eminently polemical. Parmenides' theses, that what is one, motionless, indivisible, had provoked ridicule and objections. How could one take seriously someone who denies what everyone can see? Zeno did not reply by repeating his master's arguments. He replied by attacking. His book did not directly defend Parmenides. It showed that his opponent's positions led to even more grotesque contradictions. If accepting plurality forces one to say that the same thing is both finite and infinite, large and small, like and unlike at the same time, then perhaps the Parmenidean denial of plurality was not so far-fetched after all. Zeno's likely adversaries were, in the first place, the Pythagoreans. Their cosmology, based on the plurality of things and the motion of the heavenly bodies, was the natural target of a defense of Eleatic monism. But the early atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, may also have been in his sights. The paradoxes of the arrow and the stadium directly attack the notion of indivisible particles moving through the void. A late tradition, preserved by Diogenes Laertius, relates that Zeno died under torture after taking part in a failed attempt to overthrow the tyrant of his city. The anecdote is probably legendary, but it captures the image of Zeno as a man of firm convictions, ready to go all the way in defense of what he believed. Zeno's core thesis is as much methodological as philosophical. It is not a new principle about reality but a new way of arguing about it. Zeno does not say, motion does not exist. He says, let us suppose it does, as you claim. Let us see what follows from that. The method is reductio ad absurdum, and Zeno makes it the heart of his philosophy. One grants the opponent's premises, for example, that there are many things, or that space and time are divisible, and deduces consequences from them. If those consequences are contradictory, then something is wrong with the premises. One need not say exactly what is wrong. It suffices to show that the premises lead to a dead end. One of the fragments preserved by Simplicius illustrates this strategy perfectly. Zeno begins with a concession. Let us suppose things are many. If they are many, each must have some size, for what has no size does not exist. But if each has size, then between any two things there is always a third, and between those three there are more, and so on to infinity. Each thing will thus be infinitely large. Yet at the same time, if we divide anything into its parts, each part must have some size, and the sum of infinitely many parts with size will yield an infinite whole. Plurality leads to the conclusion that each thing is at once infinitely small and infinitely large. A contradiction. The defense of Parmenides is therefore indirect. Zeno does not argue for Eleatic monism. He argues against everything that is not Eleatic monism. If plurality is contradictory, if motion is impossible, then Parmenides was right. And he was right not because his arguments were better, but because his opponent's arguments are worse. Zeno's paradoxes are the concrete arguments through which he applies his method of reductio ad absurdum. The most famous are the four paradoxes of motion, transmitted by Aristotle. The first is the dichotomy. To traverse any distance, one must first traverse half of it. But before traversing that half, one must traverse half of that half. And before that, half of that half. The series never ends. There is always a prior half to traverse. If space is infinitely divisible, motion cannot even begin. The second is Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, the swiftest of the Greeks, runs a race against a tortoise to which he grants a head start. When Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise was, it has moved a little further. When Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved a little further still. The distance shrinks infinitely, but Achilles never quite closes it. The faster never catches the slower. The third is the arrow. Consider an arrow in flight. At each instant of its trajectory, the arrow occupies a space exactly equal to itself. But to occupy a space equal to oneself is to be at rest. If at each instant the arrow is at rest, then at no instant does it move. And if it does not move at any instant, it does not move at all. The fourth is the stadium. Two rows of equal bodies move in opposite directions at the same speed. One row passes the other in half the time it takes to pass a row at rest. Half the time turns out to be equal to double the time. Aristotle considers this the weakest, but it directly targets the notion of relative velocity. The paradoxes of plurality attack the idea that many things exist. If there are many things, they must be finite in number. Exactly as many as there are, yet also infinite, because between any two things there are always others, and between those others, more. Moreover, each thing must have some size, for what has no size does not exist. But then each thing will be infinitely large, since the sum of infinitely many parts with size is infinite. And at the same time, each part will be infinitely small. The millet seed paradox attacks sensory perception. A single millet seed makes no sound when it falls. Yet a heap of seeds does make a sound. How can a sum of silences produce a sound? If the sense of hearing were reliable, the single seed would have to be audible too. Zeno does not deny that we hear the heap. He denies that we can trust what we hear. The implications of Zeno's paradoxes overflow the polemical context in which they were formulated and reach into the physics, mathematics, and logic of all subsequent centuries. The first implication is the opening of the problem of the continuum. The paradoxes of motion raise a question that neither physics nor mathematics has ceased to debate since: how is a continuous magnitude composed? If space and time are infinitely divisible, then between any two points there are always infinitely many points, and traversing them all in a finite time seems impossible. Yet if, on the contrary, space and time are composed of indivisible units, atoms of space and of time, then motion breaks down into a succession of states of rest, and the arrow never moves. Zeno does not resolve the dilemma, he inaugurates it. The second implication is Aristotle's response, which would dominate physics for 2 millennia. Aristotle distinguishes between potential and actual infinity. Space and time are not made of infinitely many parts all existing at once. They are divisible, yes, but they are not divided. The halves do not exist before we draw them. The infinite is not a completed set of points but the inexhaustible possibility of further division. With this distinction, Aristotle believes he resolves the paradoxes of the dichotomy and of Achilles. Yet the matter is far from closed. The third implication is the legacy in modern mathematics. When Newton and Leibniz developed the infinitesimal calculus in the 17th century, they took up Zeno's problem in earnest. Convergent infinite series, such as the sum of 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, which converges exactly to 1, offer a mathematical solution to the dichotomy and to Achilles. In the 20th century, Bertrand Russell and analytic philosophy reread Zeno as a forerunner of deep logical problems concerning infinity, continuity, and set theory. The fourth implication returns us to the original function of the paradoxes, the defense of Parmenides. The paradoxes fulfill their aim. They show that the alternatives to Eleatic monism, accepting plurality, motion, the reliability of the senses, lead to contradiction. Zeno does not prove Parmenides right, but he proves, with an efficacy that has kept philosophers in suspense for centuries, that his opponents are not right. Zeno's paradoxes have fascinated and perplexed for centuries. 4 hermeneutical problems stand out for their persistence. The first problem is their logical validity. Are the paradoxes flawless arguments or sophisms concealing some trick? If they are valid, why does no one accept their conclusions? No one stops walking because Zeno has proved motion to be impossible. Yet if they are sophisms, where exactly does the error lie? The difficulty of locating it precisely is what has kept the paradoxes alive. Every age has believed it had refuted them, and every age has discovered that the refutation was not as conclusive as it seemed. The second problem concerns the presuppositions the paradoxes make about space and time. If Zeno presupposes that space is infinitely divisible, the paradoxes attack the notion of the continuum. But if he presupposes that space is composed of indivisible units, they attack atomism. The question is not minor. Depending on what we presuppose, the paradoxes are directed against different opponents. Were they the Pythagoreans, who defended infinite divisibility? Were they the atomists, who posited indivisible particles? The answer determines Zeno's place in the philosophical debates of his time. The third problem affects Zeno's own philosophical status. Is there a positive doctrine behind his paradoxes, or is their sole purpose to destroy the positions of others? Plato presents him as a defender of Parmenides, and that is certainly the function of his arguments. But a philosopher who only refutes, is he a philosopher in the full sense or merely an especially skillful polemicist? The question is not rhetorical. It forces us to reflect on whether philosophy can consist solely in pointing out the mistakes of others. The fourth problem is attribution. Aristotle explicitly mentions only the four paradoxes of motion. Other sources, such as Simplicius, attribute the paradoxes of plurality and the millet seed to Zeno. Are they all authentic, or are some later amplifications, developed by other members of the Eleatic school and attributed to Zeno for convenience? The question is difficult to resolve with the available sources. The debate over Zeno has been shaped by three readings that differ in their assessment of his paradoxes and in their understanding of his philosophical project. The first is that of Aristotle, which is at once the first refutation and the first interpretation of Zeno. Aristotle responds to the paradoxes of motion with his celebrated distinction between potential and actual infinity. A distance is not composed of infinitely many parts all existing at once. It is divisible, yes, but it is not actually divided. The halves do not pre-exist the motion. We draw them as we traverse them. Zeno's paradoxes, according to Aristotle, confuse these two senses of infinity. Aristotelian physics, to a considerable extent, is born as a response to the challenges Zeno raised. The second reading is that of Bertrand Russell, who in 1903 reclaimed Zeno as a forerunner of modern logic and mathematics. For Russell, the paradoxes are neither sophisms nor verbal tricks. They are the discovery of genuine problems about the nature of the continuum, infinity, and the relation between space, time, and motion. Cantor's set theory and the analysis of convergent infinite series offer, according to Russell, a rigorous mathematical solution to the dichotomy and to Achilles. Zeno was not mistaken. He was pointing to real difficulties that the mathematics of his time could not resolve. The third reading is that of Owen, who in 1958 proposed a dialectical interpretation. For Owen, Zeno asserts absolutely nothing. There is no Zenonian ontology, no positive doctrine behind the paradoxes. His entire thought is a method: grant the opponent's premises and deduce contradictions from them. Zeno need not be right about the world. It suffices for him to show that his opponents are not. Zeno's philosophy is not a doctrine but an argumentative practice. We have reached the end of our study of Zeno of Elea. 3 points to take away. First, method is philosophy. Zeno has left us no doctrine of being, as Parmenides did, and no cosmology, as the Milesians did. His philosophy is a method, to grant the opponent's premises and deduce contradictory consequences from them. With him, reductio ad absurdum ceases to be an occasional device and becomes a systematic philosophical tool. One can do philosophy without asserting anything. It is enough to show that one's opponent cannot assert what they claim without self-contradiction. Second, the paradoxes as a defense of Parmenides. The paradoxes of motion, plurality, and perception fulfill the aim for which they were designed. They show that accepting what the senses tell us, that there are many things, that they move, that we can trust what we see and hear, leads to contradiction. Zeno does not prove Parmenides right, but he proves, with an efficacy that has withstood centuries of scrutiny, that his opponents are not right. Third, a legacy that overflows his age. Zeno's paradoxes opened the problem of the continuum, and that problem has never ceased to bear fruit. Aristotle built his physics partly in response to him. Newton and Leibniz developed the infinitesimal calculus by grappling with his challenges. Cantor, Russell, and 20th-century analytic philosophy continued to debate his arguments. Few philosophers have done so much with so little. A handful of paradoxes have kept the systems of everyone else awake at night. Zeno built no system, but his questions have kept the systems of everyone else awake at night. For those wishing to pursue Zeno further, the essential starting points begin with the classic editions of the fragments. Diels and Crans remains the canonical reference for the Greek text. The commented translation by Kirk, Raven, and Schofield provides an excellent gateway to the context. Patricia Curd's Presocratics Reader offers a recent and highly accessible English translation. As for scholarship, Aristotle's Physics, Books 6 and 8, remains the fundamental text. It is there that the paradoxes are first set out and discussed. Jonathan Barnes, in The Presocratic Philosophers of 1982, devotes penetrating chapters to Zeno's arguments and their philosophical significance. R. M. Sainsbury's Paradoxes, now in its third edition, situates Zeno's paradoxes within the broader landscape of logical and philosophical paradoxes from antiquity to the present day. In the next lesson we shall turn to Melissus of Samos, the third great representative of the Eleatic school. Unlike Parmenides, Melissus conceives what is as infinite, and unlike Zeno, he argues directly, without resorting to reductio ad absurdum. We shall examine his defense of monism, his differences from Parmenides, and his influence on later atomism. We hope you join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.